guys, thanks for joining us on the Lean to the Left podcast, where we focus on progressive politics and the important social issues of our time. Our guest today is Kaivan Shroff, a political commentator, attorney, and triple Ivy League alum. We're going to be talking to Kaivan today about the Democratic Party, the challenges it faces, what it can do better, and what needs to be done to attract young voters and candidates. Now, Kaivan worked as a digital strategist on Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign and was a 2024 presidential DNC delegate for Kamala Harris. Previously was on the litigation team for Everytown for gun safety. So Kaivan, thanks so much for joining us on our show.
Great to join.
Listen, we're recording this just a couple days after the nationwide No Kings rallies that saw more than 7 million Americans protest the totalitarian actions of Donald Trump. You attended one in New York City. How'd it go, man?
I did. I went to the first one as well. This one was definitely much more attended and lots bigger of a spectacle. Went on for really the whole day. And it was a great feeling. It's very easy to feel jaded about everything happening and the pillars of democracy are crumbling around us. But it was a good reminder that the people coming together in a mass movement like that still has a lot of power and impact, if not just to remind people that there are so many people in our communities who are trying to defend these same rights and norms as we progress here in the fight against fascism.
Kaivan, did you talk to anyone that was particularly telling in terms of their concerns and what they were there for and why?
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting takeaway. There was all this hype from the Trump administration really trying to paint these protests as something that was going to be violent, calling all 7 million participants terrorists and Hamas supporters and all of that rhetoric. And
Right.
I think what was most interesting to me showing up is it really was a bit of an older demographic, it seemed, that showed up in mass. And I think younger voters, for a couple of reasons, may be less excited about the tool of showing up in person and protesting like that, just based on the history of our, I think, recent 5 years, 10 years of seeing a lot of big demonstrations like that, with a big question mark of, were the Black Lives Matter protests effective? Where are we today? What were the wins there? And I think there's argument that they were somewhat effective, but the Women's March, right? We've had a lot of these moments, and I think younger people don't necessarily see this as the key to change. And I think older generations have lived through movements like this, where showing up in this way and these large demonstrations have actually impacted outcomes in a short time frame. So that was interesting to see, but it was also nice to see, honestly, some of the maybe not more moderate, but certainly less loud online and more just civilly engaged people showing up to defend what they valued. And I know the right really wanted to paint this. They were saying it's all old white people that showed up. Old white people show up to vote too. So I think it was an interesting outcome for the march, and really a lot of sort of narrative shifting over the last week.
It surprises me that you made that observation about more older people than young people showing up. I would have thought it had been the opposite. I was not able to go to the one here in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, because of some family issues. I really did want to be there, but I did see photographs of it and some reports. And that seems to be the case here too. It looks to me like it was the older folks that showed up more than the younger ones. And I'm surprised and a bit disappointed with that.
Well, I think obviously young people did show up too. I think one of the takeaways was to just see how many of these older Americans did take the time to show up. And I think some of the most impactful videos I saw were folks in wheelchairs, folks who had just gotten seats taken out so they could participate, and just that level of commitment to making a statement and standing together with neighbors on these issues, especially at a time when ICE and other, efforts from the federal government really are deeply impacting communities in ways that a lot of those most effective aren't able to show up to a march like this, because a lot of those folks aren't even comfortable leaving their house. So
Yeah.
definitely a positive weekend.
Okay. All right. Now, every day it seems like Trump takes new steps to impose his own rule, from trying to force colleges and universities to kowtow to his curriculum demands, to bullying the news media, deploying the National Guard in cities largely led by Democrats like Chicago and San Francisco. And of course, shutting down the government. What's your view about all of that, and what should Democrats be doing to counter all this stuff?
I think it's twofold. Part of this is expected. Hillary Clinton warned about a lot of these specific steps. Kamala Harris warned about a lot of these things, down to that he was going to send troops into blue cities. So it's fascism 101. And obviously, Trump spent a lot of his time out of office cozying up to dictators like Viktor Orban, getting their playbook. And now he's using that playbook. So part of it, I think, is just informing people and making real some points that just haven't been part of the conversation for the last several decades because we've taken so many of our norms and precedents for granted. But even down to, obviously, Trump is doing what he's doing, but to see these schools cave and to see these big institutions cave and to see the Supreme Court overuse and abuse the shadow docket to control a lot of the policy outcomes in the country, it's really more than just what Trump is doing. And I think we have to just pause and look at that as Democrats and think about Democrats hold themselves, I think, or at least in the past, to some sort of moral or higher standard. And that's obviously an ideal, but I think we have to think about the practicality about some of that idealism when we get back into power. So I actually find it quite compelling, folks that are saying we do need to figure out what accountability is going to look like for this moment in history, because that's going to be a big part, I think, of moving forward. Second, though, I do want to say it's not just all about focusing on Trump and the threats to democracy, because we've seen that isn't a message that is resonating with at least some part of the electorate. It doesn't convince them, no matter how much information you share, no matter how many times Trump says he wants to be a dictator. They don't really care. They don't really understand the real implications of it. Of course, they feel some of those implications, those farmers right now, of Trump willy-nilly on tariffs, Trump just unilaterally taking control of different American companies. So all of that ultimately does affect people, but they don't see the through line. I think Democrats need to also offer new policy ideas, not just talk about Trump. What's exciting? How do we own the future? There's some congressmen that have interesting ideas around AI and things like that. Lots of conversation about data centers in certain communities. So how do we take those issues and not just frame it as how are Democrats going to regulate this new space, but how are Democrats going to create an ecosystem that makes outcomes fairer for the people who tend to lose out from modernization?
That's an interesting observation. So, are you saying that younger Democratic voters, younger voters, are more interested in those types of issues than they are in the traditional issues that typically are the concern and bread and butter of the Democratic Party?
I think there's an argument to be made that a lot of the economic issues have been what Democrats have tried to talk about, and maybe they haven't communicated it effectively. So that's one piece of it. But I think young voters care about democracy, absolutely. They've grown up with a different sense of democracy, even if 8 years ago, we're talking about Trump coming on the scene, basically more than that now. So a lot of people in their 20s who are now invested in politics probably were in high school or middle school, maybe not so focused on all of those things. And so they don't have the expectations and standards even of somebody like me who's 31, what to expect in our democracy on civil discourse and all of those things. But I do think, regardless of age, frankly, people are looking for what leaders can do for them. And it's a distant concept for a lot of people, democracy and these institutional norms, whereas the economy, the future of their own lives is very obviously urgent and present for them. So I think talking about that in a more tangible way is going to be important. And things like AI, things like crypto, by the way, things like psilocybin and psychedelics, all of these new areas, I think Democrats should at least, it doesn't mean that we have to go all in or say crypto's the future or any of that, but let's have thoughtful ideas and policies that don't come from a place of no, we're not going to explore this new thing that folks are excited about.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. A lot of people in my generation don't even know what the hell crypto is all about.
I stay away myself, but it's a relevant area for sure.
I gotta tell you, I haven't got a clue. And you said you're 31?
Yes.
All right. So I'm more than twice your age. So way more than twice your age. Anyhow, now there's a guy that's only 2 years older than you. He's running in
Yes.
New York for mayor. His name is Zoran Mandani, which Vance can't even pronounce. Uh,
Yep. Whole lot of them.
he's shaking things up within the party a little bit, especially when he knocked off 10 other candidates, including Cuomo, to win the Democratic nomination for mayor in New York. So, what does that nomination, his fundraising success, his subsequent reaction by many old line party leaders that really just want him to go away, tell us about what the Democrats need to do nationally?
I think it is interesting to see the New York City mayor's race. I've been following it super closely as somebody in the city because Democrats do have this tendency, I find, to look for a one size fits all answer to their electoral woes. And that's just not how politics shakes out. I think politics, for all the modern media that we have and all the social media that makes a lot of these stories national, the actual votes and elections are still local. And so we're seeing actually, I think, a trend of influencers running for office and failing miserably. I will say, to Mamdani's credit, he does well digitally and online, and I think he's gotten a lot of credit for that, the style of his campaign. But the
Right.
reality is he coupled that early on with major grassroots organizing to go knock the doors, to go make the calls, tens of thousands of real human volunteers, not just online people, making the case for his candidacy. And I think a lot of folks miss that. That's the more boring, less sexy part of it. But you don't win without that. And we saw Deja Fox, who was a young TikTok influencer, run earlier this summer in a primary, also against a more quote unquote establishment Dem, if you want to paint it that way. And she lost by 40 points, despite millions of impressions and so many national news headlines around the race, because she didn't have those community based relationships. She didn't have that demonstrated record. So I think the Mandani excitement is positive in one sense, in that it's obviously nice to excite people about politics again and give them hope. My concern, and I actually have a new piece out today saying I don't think Schumer and Jeffries really should play the game of endorsing him for a couple of reasons. We just saw the debate, the first debate for the general election here, and there's a lot of back and forth of the further left wing of the party and the more moderate wing of the party, and why do the moderates not rally behind Mamdani? Kathy Hochul, our governor here, did endorse him, and we saw on that debate stage he refused to endorse her back. We saw the debate moderators asked, who can you name a modern president that you liked? And he couldn't name a single modern Democratic president in the last 80 years that he thought was great. So I think those moments reveal that maybe that he's not really a representative of the Democratic Party nationally. And I think the reality is, you look at our closer races, you look at the electoral makeup of who's elected Democrats, they're far more moderate. So I think to paint the country with that broad brush isn't a winning strategy in this moment. At the same time, I hope he's successful. The reality is, it's a little bit of a 2016 redux, where it's easy to promise a whole lot of things that you can't deliver. And the electorate tends to get excited about those things, especially on the left. We'll see next year, frankly, if he's able to be successful. We have a very complicated funding system here in New York State, where most of what the city can afford is determined by the assembly statewide. So are they really going to vote for a budget that costs their upstate folks more to fund the New York City budget? Probably not. And so how will voters respond to that? Will they feel deceived? Obviously, Kathy Hochul will be running for re-election during that time. Obviously, it's midterm. So I think it's not a great story, actually, to tie the future of the Democratic Party to Zoran Mamdani.
Okay, that's a great thought. Now, MAGA Republicans are attempting to use Mamdani's success to brand Democrats as socialists, left wing nutcases, wackos. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, look, I don't really think MAGA comes from a place of ideology. So they see folks like Donald Trump saying he wants a federal pharmacy. They see him seizing 10% of Intel, an American company. Lots of socialist playbook moves, frankly. And they don't care. They think it's the greatest thing ever. Whereas I think, to my point, I don't think if we see Schumer and Jeffries endorse him, that argument that the National Party has embraced Mamdani holds very well. Obviously, Hochul did do the endorsement. Frankly, my take on it is she didn't want to be in a position where Eric Adams dropped out and then suddenly she had to weigh in between Cuomo, who she obviously hates, and Mamdani, so she got ahead of that endorsement, and also probably some pragmatism that she realizes he is going to be the mayor and she's going to have to work with him as a partner in New York City. So I wouldn't read too much into that, and frankly, we haven't seen the National Party embrace Mamdani, and it's been a tension point with some of his supporters. It's really interesting to see, though, because a lot of the response is, oh, it's AIPAC, oh, it's these corporate donors controlling the Democrats, and that's why they won't get behind Mamdani. And obviously there's a lot of issues with money in politics, and that's a separate conversation, I think, but that's not the case. These local elected leaders around the country want to get reelected. They're not answering to 2-3 donors. These ideas are not popular with their voters. Most voters want a more moderated Democratic Party. So the louder wing of the party is the further left. And it's not clear that they show up to vote. It's not clear that they show up to actually do their part, even when you have a president, for all the rehashing and rewriting of history, frankly, about the Biden presidency. He was really one of the most progressive presidents in modern American history, period. He was the most pro-union president. A lot of these issues he actually really did lead on, and I don't know that the Biden-Harris administration was rewarded for that by the left, despite giving a lot of leeway to Bernie and AOC.
I think you're right. Okay, now down in Texas, there's this guy, James Tallarico.
Yep.
I guess he could be considered the polar opposite of Mamdani. Presbyterian seminarian. He's emphasizing his faith in his U.S. Senate campaign. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, actually, you say he's the polar opposite of Mamdani, but in some sense, his impact, I think, is similar, which again, it's this desperation from Democrats to find a one-size-fits-all solution. So you see him go on Joe Rogan, he goes viral for a couple nice moments, and all of a sudden, Democrats are talking about a random person they never heard of being the president. And we see that pattern all the time. Nothing against him. I've seen some of his ads. They're somewhat compelling. I will say there is this reflex, I think, some people in the party have to the loss of Hillary Clinton, the loss of Vice President Harris, that we need to get much more to these like straight white male Christian voices, and that's who is a viable candidate these days. And I think there's probably some truth to, there are obviously challenges of racism and sexism in the country that play a role in some of these outcomes, but I don't know that somebody, Bashir comes to mind, even Buttigieg comes to mind, these kind of, they're a little boring, frankly, these personalities that sort of do the jujitsu Bible verse trick where it's, oh, here's what MAGA says about religion and here's the flip of it. And it's interesting to see go viral on TikTok every once in a while, but I don't know that modern Democratic Party voters who are less religious than ever, frankly, so is the electorate overall across the country, are going to be mobilized and excited at a national level, at least, by some of these more stilted, very religious voices on a daily basis. And I think we're in a media landscape right now where if you can't hold the audience every day, it doesn't play over time. And I think we've seen that, by the way, with Pete Buttigieg, who was a rising star, but frankly has struggled to come back onto the national scene as somebody interesting and exciting.
Why do you think so many young men moved to Trump in the last election?
I do think there's something to be said for the culture, discussion, and over policing is really not the right word, but over regulating social behaviors that maybe don't cross certain lines, but there's a lot of discussion, obviously, around men's engagement with women, men and careers, all of that stuff. And I just think the message hasn't been positive on the Democratic side. Now, I think we saw in the leaked chat of the young Republicans that a lot of the criticism around Democrats missing with that group is, yes, it's a group that has been really poisoned by hate and online discourse where they're talking about Hitler and being extremely racist and celebrating rape. And these are leading figures in the Republican Party. And just to be clear, people in their late 20s and early 30s, some people in the Trump administration. And that really is a large segment. Charlie Kirk, for all the discussion about how horrible, which was valid, obviously his murder and the political violence that we've seen in the last several months across the spectrum are, really was somebody who rose to prominence spewing really bigoted, hateful ideas and had really built an infrastructure across the country to target young folks with those ideas. And to say that Kamala Harris going on Joe Rogan would have solved those problems, I think is a little bit juvenile of an analysis. There's something much more deep and structural there that I don't know any messaging from the Democratic Party can solve alone. Part of it is actually policy and creating opportunities and creating healthy outlets for folks at a time when, the Trump administration's firing people that work on mental health and all of that. So it's interesting. Everybody's in bash the Democrats mode, and they certainly deserve some criticism, maybe a lot of criticism, but I do think some of the stuff is structural. Where do they go with it? I think, honestly, two things. One, young voters did help deliver the Biden-Harris win in 2020. At the same time, the rise of social media has created this cottage industry of influencer adjacent, younger folks who want some media, who want positioning in the political space. Do they really represent and resonate their generation? Most of the time, no. I would say if you look at some of the younger Gen Z influencers, they're not people that if you actually went to their school or you went to their college, that you might think are leading the social scene or defining culture or shaping it in any way. It's these very sterile characters that say stuff that older Democrats wish young folks thought. So I don't think that's been a compelling strategy to try to pay these influencers to do messaging. But I do think there's opportunity to focus less on winning this young vote. By the way, young voters haven't showed up in the numbers that I think people have suggested. Obviously, young voters matter. Trying so hard has never been something that resonates with young voters. So I think obsessing about these weird Taylor Swift tweets or going on every bro podcast is not going to necessarily be the move that wins it. I think focusing on policies that aren't just impacting young folks, but really everyone in the country, perhaps young folks especially because they're growing up in Trump's America. The economy's not great right now. There aren't a lot of positive prospects for returns to college are down. All of those dynamics are making it harder for young people, but those same problems are what all Americans face. So I think talking about things that way a little bit more is positive as well.
I read this morning that 47% of U.S. adults are not very or not at all confident that if they needed to, that they could find a good job.
Mm-hmm.
That's up 10 points from last September. If that holds, how might that affect support for Trump among young voters?
I think that's a really interesting dynamic. We were talking about Mamdani before, and I see some similarities with Trump as well, because Trump did make gains with young voters and Latino voters. And I think we saw quickly, by 6 months in June, there was a poll showing Trump had dropped double digits already with young voters, because when you promise a bunch of stuff, like you promise less foreign conflict, more jobs, grocery prices going down, all of those things, and then you don't deliver on any of them, people get frustrated. So that's why we actually saw here in New York, there were 2024 Trump voters that turned around and voted for Mamdani, which is, I think, shocking to some people. But I think a lot of voters are vulnerable to the latest good thing they've heard. So if you tell them you're going to give them free money and all this stuff and everything's going to be great, they buy into it. You tell them, as Trump did, that, oh, Democrats are bringing in all these other immigrants and we're going to protect you and we're not going to go after nonviolent people and we're not going to go after citizens as they've done actually. And Latinos believe that. They haven't seen that now. Their communities have been torn apart. They've been targeted. Even citizens that are Hispanic are now being targeted. So I think those types of things really make you plummet with a demographic. So part of it is just failing on those promises Trump campaigned on. But I think also that gets back to my point that Democrats would succeed by offering what the alternative vision is. And frankly, the way they talked about Biden's economy and Biden's job creation and all of that wasn't landing. It was very data heavy, very stats heavy, not grounding things in reality in the day-to-day of people's lives. And so I think we've seen some little efforts that maybe less economy focused, but small things like Gavin Newsom banning when they make ads louder on your TV than your actual show, right? But these are silly. They sound so silly. Like, why is the governor spending time on that? But actually, it's something that affects your daily life. Those are very easy policy wins I think Democrats can focus on. And not to say the Biden-Harris administration didn't focus on credit card fees and all of those things, but I don't know that they ever communicated those wins effectively to folks. So I do think some of that retail, easy politics is a good idea.
Oh, I think that's a great point. Trump is a master at doing that, at picking out little things that piss people off and talking about them. Like, for example, toilets that you have to flush 3 times in order to get them to work.
Yep, Trump in the shower pressure. Gosh, remember that. I don't know if it ever came true, but
Yeah, yeah. All right. So tell me this. What do you think about the way Trump is trying to bully the colleges and universities of this country, like Harvard, which just decided to kick in $500 million in a settlement with this guy?
yeah, did that come through officially? I know he keeps saying it, but
I don't know if he did or not.
okay, no, but to your point, they do keep discussing it. I think it's not surprising, but it is disappointed. So I did spend 10 years at Ivy League institutions, and I think part of what they preach is that they are this pillar of inquiry and academic freedom and democracy, and they're often labeled far left and all that. I think it's far from the case based on my experience. If anything, these schools bend over backwards to cater to the most conservative voices there, and when I was at Harvard Law School, the best funded, most privileged group at Harvard Law School is no doubt the Federalist Society. You could not make an argument for anything coming close. They are well funded. They are given every permission that they're given. They are incredibly influential. So those types of groups have been around for forever. They're not new, and these schools invest in them absolutely. So I do think people underestimate how conservative and strategic these schools are. They always make the decision that is best for them. It's about their enduring brand and legacy. Like any other big organization or institution, there's no sort of virtue beyond that, quite frankly. And we saw that my undergrad, Brown, did do a $50 million settlement with Trump when, frankly, there was no legal basis for them to have to do that. I don't think any legal expert thought that they would lose in court. It was really just a payoff. And so it's disappointing to see that. It's a huge failure in leadership. I think we've seen some pushback from schools like MIT and others that aren't necessarily thought of as the bastions of liberal arts, but they've demonstrated leadership in not removing their president when Elise Stefanik was pushing for that, and Harvard's president resigned, and UPenn's president resigned. Recently, they rejected Trump's compact effort, one of the first big schools to do that. I thought that was really important because the minute that you sign on as an academic institution to be restricted by the federal government's demands, you are no longer a place of academic freedom. And that's a huge blow to the reputation of any academic institution that agrees to that.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think about Hegseth trying to force journalists to agree to restrictions on their work or they'll get kicked out?
Yeah, I think it's obviously incredibly unhealthy for democracy. And it's not surprising. He's totally out of his depths. I think he's made a fool of himself repeatedly. And he's somebody that is concerned that if the press is there, he'll look dumber and less competent because that's been his track record. At the same time, of course, it's alarming to see the silence from all those powerful self-anointed free speech warriors on the right, like Elon Musk, like Bill Ackman, who've cried about censorship and all of this. They don't care that all of a sudden the Secretary of Defense is no longer allowing journalists in. That's highly concerning. And obviously you can apply that same criticism to their silence on Trump's efforts against higher education, where once again they were focused on wokeism and DEI and cancel culture. And now that's exactly what the right is bringing to these schools. So lots of hypocrisy there, and obviously a concerning moment when one side like that will keep quiet because it serves their political purposes and at the expense, obviously, of our most treasured democratic norms.
Do you know this guy, David Hogg at Leaders We Deserve?
Yep.
I thought you might. What was your take when he left the DNC because he plans to support young candidates against old-line Democratic lawmakers that
Look, like my take, to be super blunt, is I think David is really what's wrong with the young sort of crop of leadership in the party. He's somebody who's really only had a media profile. He really had a lot of help building, obviously, in the wake of a tragedy, gun violence prevention nonprofit. Of course, there was also other ones like Moms Demand Action and Everytown, which I worked for. But David did put on some of those big marches we saw for gun violence. And to the credit of that group, March for Our Lives, they did get some attention on this issue. Now, this was many years ago, and he hasn't really kept up the work. He's really become a lightning rod for controversy, lots of strange and bad take tweets that he then later deletes, and really somebody who's inherited million plus followers, being somebody that was the Democrats' go-to young voice. And I think this gets back to that criticism I was making of the disconnect between some of the figures that the Democratic establishment has uplifted as this is our young youth representative for everyone, that doesn't actually resonate with younger voters. So I don't know most Gen Z folks that are inspired by David Hogg or feel like he's an accurate representative. He's somebody that goes on Bill Maher, which I don't know a Gen Zer on earth that watches Bill Maher, to go say that, oh, young guys just want to party and have fun and Democrats need to message to folks like me better. Nobody thinks that's appealing, and that's really capturing the moment with young voters. I think tactically, he was going to lose his election for the DNC vice chair when they had to do that revote on a technicality because they didn't do the gender balance right. So he stepped away. I don't know that it was a convenient fundraising moment for him to say he was pushed out. He wasn't really pushed out. He could have run again and seen if he would beat Malcolm Kenyatta, but he, in the first round, got less votes than Malcolm. And so that was, of course, likely. I think his approach of arbitrarily picking young folks to primary other incumbents isn't a strategy that serves the party well. It doesn't have a vision. There's no sort of slate of policy issues that the candidates have to sign on to. There's no sort of specifics other than just being younger. And I don't know that we've seen that being younger without something more is a reason to put folks into office. I think, if anything, the argument is young people have grown up in a different context and had different life experiences than older generations because so much has changed in the country. And so it's important to have that perspective and that voice and that lived experience at the table. And I think we have folks like Maxwell Frost who are great representatives in that regard, who, are less about doing the national media loops and the cottage industry of David Hoggism. So I think it's been disappointing to see that he's continued to do this. There's been a lot of reporting as well on just like total mismanagement of funds, total failure to deliver on the promises, buying of gym memberships instead of actually donating to these candidates. So it hasn't been a huge success, I'd say.
Okay, interesting. Now, what about you? You've got a hell of a background. You're extremely well spoken. You've got a tremendous education. You are, I'm sure you've got a lot of followers in your social media sphere and so on. What are your plans?
Yeah, I think hopefully I'm a good representative for some good democratic ideas. I'm excited to be plugged in locally here in New York. I work with a nonprofit in DC that focuses on bipartisanship, which is obviously a dying sort of practice. Sometimes gives me a glimmer of hope to get down there and put on one of our events and just hear folks in a room talking and exchanging real values and ideas. And I hope that, look, it's an exciting time in the Democratic Party. I think there's a lot of opportunity. People focus on there's a quote unquote lack of leadership, but actually there's a lot of chance to have these discussions, to have some polite criticism and disagreement and figure all that stuff out now and lead forward with good ideas. So I hope to be part of those conversations. In 2024, I was a delegate for Vice President Harris, and I do a lot of TV and other interviews and really do try to champion our candidates and our party. But I think after the election, there is a need for some healthy debrief and some real conversations and some criticism and reflection. And I don't know that I've seen enough of that from the party. And I think it's very easy, especially on social media, if you post one little criticism, constructive feedback, anything about a Democratic candidate, it can get really shut down really fast. And people say, oh, I'm unfollowing you and this and that. And I think we just have to build up a little bit of a thicker skin for some of that discourse if we're really going to move things forward. I'm one of those folks. I have the Substack going. I got the YouTube. I am excited about independent media in a sense, because I think, for example, we've seen the right exploit right-wing media echo chamber to really focus attention on key stories that matter to them, and then those get picked up by mainstream media. In contrast, 7 million people, as we started out the show, showed up to that No Kings protest, one of the largest, if not the largest, single-day demonstration in modern history. And the New York Times put that on page 23 the day after that march. After page 8 was what people are eating in Italy. I'm just saying. So it's a really tough infrastructure. And I do think I'm excited. Obviously, people are listening to your show as well. These independent outlets of trusted voices that are communicating information, but also, I think, offering different information than the legacy media. So that's what I'm focused on right now.
All right. So what about elective office? Is that in your future?
I don't know. Nobody's called me yet. So
Well, come on. Don't duck. Don't be a politician, duck and weave. Come
Hey,
on.
you know the right people, send them my way. And my family, I grew up in New York. My family's in New York, and it's definitely a bit of a different landscape here in the city. We got a lot of a deep bench, let's say. But always happy to grab coffee if anyone has any ideas.
All right. So the guy ducked and weaved and didn't answer the question. So you can look for him on the ballot sometime soon.
Thank you so much. Great to join.
How can people reach out to you if they want to learn more about what you're up to?
Yeah, so I have a Substack newsletter. I post a couple times a week, and I interview some interesting folks as well. Just interviewed the executive director of Swing Left, if you remember, one of those early resistance organizations, and they're still plugging along. So that's on Substack. My name is Kaivan, Kaivan Shroff, Shroff, and that's my handle across social media, Kaivan Shroff. So hope to find you there.
All right, buddy. Listen, thanks for showing up.
Yeah, of course.